April 28, 2019. It's a warm spring Sunday in Westchester Township, Ohio, about 20 miles north of downtown Cincinnati.
It is a very well-to-do area. It is a fast-growing area. It has good schools, it has good jobs.
It's kind of an up-and-coming area here in Ohio.
Westchester also offers an escape from the safety concerns that come with living in the big city.
The crime rate is very low, which really makes this a safe environment.
So it's unusual when a flurry of 911 calls comes in to Westchester Police around 9:45 p.m. that evening.
911, where's your emergency?
I hear gunshots. I've heard 5 now.
The calls are coming from an apartment complex on the west side of town.
Some guy is running around banging all the doors. He just doesn't sound right.
As officers race to the scene, one more call comes into 911, this time from 36-year-old Indian immigrant Gurpreet Singh.
My wife and my family are on the ground. They're bleeding.
Gurpreet is extremely emotional. Police suspect he's the man who's been banging on neighbors' doors for help.
Somebody help me, please!
When first responders arrive at the apartment complex, they proceed with caution.
The apartment unit was on the bottom floor, all the way in the back of the apartment complex.
Gurpreet is outside waiting for them.
Let me see your hands! Hands!
As officers approach Gurpreet, they see he's covered in blood.
Down on the ground! Down on the ground! Down on the ground! Lay on your belly!
At this point, police are unsure if Gurpreet is a victim in this crime or a potential suspect.
Leave my wife! Leave my wife, please! I got cover. You handcuff.
Gurpreet begs police to help his wife, Shalinderjeet Kaur, who's still inside the apartment.
The alarm going off, we're gonna be going in.
Can they help Shalinderjeet before it's too late?
For Indian native Shalinderjeet Kaur, nothing was more important than faith and family.
She was really nice. She was really caring.
Her parents, Hakika and Paramjit, had raised her as a devout member of the Sikh faith.
Sikh means learner. We believe in all humanity as a one, regardless who they are. Everyone belongs to God. We are supposed to work hard with our own hands and share with others who need it.
Another tenet of the Sikh faith is arranged marriage,
which is how Shalinderjeet met her husband, Gurpreet Singh, in March of 2002.
Shalinderjeet's parents knew Gurpreet's parents from the Sikh community, and together they decided the two would be a perfect match.
They met first time at their wedding. There were a lot of people there. There were singers. She was really looking pretty.
And after the wedding, it seemed like the couple was meant to be.
These two got along. They really enjoyed being with each other.
They seemed like a very loving couple and a good team.
They eventually had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Shalinderjeet stayed home with the kids while Gurpreet worked in long-haul trucking.
With Gurpreet on the road often, Shalinderjeet's loving parents, Hakikat and Parmjeet, moved in to help with the children.
The whole family was really nice and caring.
Hakikat and Gurpreet were also trying to open up a business together to bring in another stream of income.
They saved money for a couple of years, and they were eventually able to purchase a gas station.
Together, the family was making strides towards a bright future.
They were really working together as a team.
But now, investigators are making their way inside the family's apartment and fearing the worst.
Based on the 911 call from Gurpreet, it sounds like there's been a massacre inside this apartment.
And once inside, a gruesome scene is revealed.
They're searching with their guns drawn, and they're encountering several victims.
Gurpreet's entire family is dead.
Indian natives Shailendrajit Kaur and Gurpreet Singh had built their own American dream in Westchester Township, Ohio, with the help of Shailendrajit's parents, Hakikat and Parmjeet. But on April 28, 2019, local police have just discovered a bloody scene inside the family's apartment.
In the kitchen, they find the body of Gurpreet's wife, Shailendrajit.
She was shot multiple times in the head, both from front to back and on the side of her head.
It appeared that she had been cooking food when she was murdered.
This is what set the fire alarm off right here.
In the living room, there are two more female victims.
Both of them have been shot in the head multiple times as well. I mean, this was complete overkill.
There were a bunch of 9mm shell casings throughout the apartment.
But the carnage doesn't end there.
There's a fourth victim in one of the bedrooms.
He was found in his bed with the sheets kind of pulled up to his neck still, and he had been shot, I believe, 6 times in the face. It was a very grisly, very awful scene for law enforcement to encounter, a very traumatic way for these folks to die, just horrific.
It's obvious that this happened very quickly. The entire family must have been gunned down in a matter of seconds before anyone had the chance to run or defend themselves.
As police continue processing the inside of the apartment, another officer is outside speaking with the sole survivor of this massacre, 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh.
I got to get information out of you to be able to help everybody involved, okay? So you're very, very important to me right now, okay? And I'm not trying to be rude or anything like that, but the more info I get, the better I can do my job, okay? Yes. Okay. Who all lives in the building?
Gurpreet explains that along with his wife and 3 children, he shares the apartment with his mother and father-in-law, Parmjeet Kaur and Hakikat Singh Panag.
He also explains that his wife's aunt, Amaji Kaur, had been staying with them during an extended visit to the United States. So this explains who the other 3 victims are inside the apartment.
Gurpreet says, thankfully, his 3 children are currently with other relatives.
They were going to take them out for dinner and to see a movie and get ice cream.
Not right now, sir. Everybody inside is deceased. That's why it's very, very important for you to hold together and help me out so we can figure out what happened tonight, okay? I need you to be strong for me, okay?
At that point, Gurpreet is transported back to police headquarters to meet with homicide detectives and give an official statement.
When detectives walk into the room to begin their interview with Gurpreet, it's obvious that he's still in a hysterical state about what had just occurred.
Sorry for your loss. It was very important that we get some information from you, okay?
Okay. At this point, he's going through the emotional trauma, starting to realize that his entire family is dead.
But the question still remains, is he the one that killed them?
Detectives ask Gurpreet to walk them through the evening leading up to the shooting.
I was home all day because my back was hurting.
He explained that he spent most of the day lying down.
Gurpreet starts to feel better later in the evening, decides to leave out, as he says, around 7 o'clock, and go and work on his truck.
Gurpreet explains that his semi-truck needed some maintenance before his next long-haul run.
He was having an issue with the lights on the truck, and he really wanted to work on that.
Once he finished, went and got some gas, and he headed home just before 10 o'clock that night.
When he came back, the door was open. to his apartment. He said that was not unusual because especially when they cook in that apartment, they keep the door open.
But Gurpreet says when he walked inside the apartment, the sight that greeted him was anything but usual.
That's when he made the gruesome discovery of his family members.
He tried to get her to respond, but he was unsuccessful. That's why he had blood all over him.
Somebody help me, please!
At that point, Gurpreet says he went into panic mode.
Afterwards, he went yelling and screaming to the neighbors, trying to ask everyone to call 911, asking for help.
Some guy is running around banging all the doors.
It's been all such a blur.
Gurpreet pleads with the detectives to find the person who killed his family.
Detectives asked him who could have done this, and he told them his family didn't have any issues or problems with anyone.
He said that he could not think of a single person who would have ever done this.
There was no reason why anybody would want to do this to his family. They asked Mr. Singh if his marriage was good, if anybody had cheated on anybody or something that could cause strain on the relationship.
Gurpreet adamantly denied having any issues whatsoever with his wife. He called her a good woman.
She was amazing. We loved each other very much.
To detectives, Gurpreet Singh seems like a broken man. But is there more to the story?
As they're escorting him out of the interview room, investigators tell Gurpreet they need to collect the bloody clothing he's been wearing since he was placed in custody at the scene.
They also asked Gurpreet to swab his hands to see if he had gunshot residue.
I've been telling everything you wanted to ask me. Hey, we're gonna get Sir, please.
They say it's just a step that we have to go to make sure that you're not a suspect in this case.
So investigators are taken aback when his entire demeanor changes.
He refuses to consent to the swabs of his hands, and Gurpreet suddenly becomes very hostile.
No, you have to stay here. Why? Because I said so. No.
After wrapping up their interview with 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh regarding the brutal massacre of his families, investigators are surprised when his demeanor suddenly shifts.
At the end of the interview, they tell him they need to do a gunshot residue test on his hands, but he's not having it.
He refuses to consent to the swabs of his hands, and so ultimately the police had to obtain a search warrant.
Sir, please.
We are going to get a search warrant for your hand.
Please.
You have to stay here.
Please. No, get your search warrant. Come to me. Do whatever
No, you have to stay here.
Why?
Because I said so.
No.
We are getting a search warrant.
What was a very low-key interview with Gurpreet suddenly becomes very hostile.
He just kind of loses it at this point. He's very rowdy and cantankerous.
You're treating me like I am the criminal.
I'm not saying you did anything wrong, but you're the first guy to show up where 4 people have been murdered. And we have certain evidence we need to get if it exists.
Gurpreet is ready to walk out, and he says that he needs to go home and take care of his children.
No matter how detectives try to explain it to Gurpreet, he refuses to consent to the gunshot residue test willingly.
You're not allowed to leave.
Why?
Because
Under what crime I do?
you have potential evidence on you that we need to get with a search warrant.
Finally, detectives get a signed search warrant from a judge, and Gurpreet complies.
They really don't have any evidence to hold him at this point, so he's free to leave after they do the gunshot residue test.
Once the test has been sent to the crime lab, detectives can't help but wonder, was Gurpreet's refusal to cooperate the innocent behavior of an exhausted, broken-hearted man? Or something more nefarious?
It's normal and natural for family members to be a bit defensive and emotional at the onset. But you would also think if you are completely innocent, you want to do everything you can to help investigators quickly find who the suspect is.
He could have just been genuinely offended that in this time of grief, police thought he could be capable of killing his family.
As investigators continue their search for answers, news of the tragic massacre spreads throughout the community.
I was in a car, my family called me and they said, just come home, just come home. That's it. And when I just got home, everybody just came to me and they just hugged me.
My younger brother called me about 6:15 in the morning. I could not believe what he told me. I thought maybe I'm having a nightmare. We lost 4 relatives all of a sudden. Then I started shaking, I was crying, and I could not stand.
But Ajaib also has information he believes could prove crucial to the investigation.
After the initial shock wore off, he went down to the station to meet with investigators.
Ajaib explains that his deceased relatives had recently been involved in a tense land dispute with an Indian real estate investor named Satinder Bhatia.
Namely, Gurpreet's father-in-law, Hakikat, had some bad blood with this man.
He got into deal with the Hakikat because Hakikat was selling his land in India.
Hakikat had a big property in India. It was multi-million property there.
But after Hakikat had already signed over the land to Satinder, the deal went awry.
What happened was a recession hit, and therefore he couldn't purchase the land.
And Satinder had other debts to pay.
He was involved in illegal activity here in US. He had committed some serious crime, but he fled to India before FBI could arrest him.
They are drug charges here in the US.
Ajaib explains that regardless of Satinder's refusal to cooperate, Hakikat was determined to get his land back.
He was saying, give me the money, I will transfer ownership because this is the contract we wrote.
It was becoming very contentious because Satinder was not bending or transferring ownership of the land back to Hakikat, but he also wasn't paying for it.
So Hakikat decided to get the courts involved.
Hakikat filed a case in the court, and court decided in favor of Hakikat.
Satinder and his associates were furious.
They threatened him. They say, you got to back out of this thing or else you will lose your life.
Now had Satinder followed through on his violent claims.
Ajaib tells the detectives that he wouldn't be surprised if somebody in that land dispute might be trying to hurt the family.
They must have hired somebody. That is what my feeling is.
Thanks to Ajaib Singh, detectives have uncovered a possible motive behind the brutal execution-style murders of 39-year-old Salinderjeet Kaur, her parents Parmjeet and Hakikat, and her aunt Armajit.
The family had recently been involved in a tense land dispute and legal battle with a dangerous real estate investor named Satinder Bhatia.
Detectives were wondering if a hit was put out to eliminate an entire family opposed to selling things in court in India over the land.
They must have hired somebody. That is what my feeling is.
This kind of lines up with the idea that maybe it was a skilled assassin that tried to take out this entire family.
In fact, Ajaib reveals that he spoke with his sister Armajit just hours before the murders, and she didn't seem like herself.
She called around about 6:40, 6:45 in the evening. She was saying that she was scared at that time. She was talking, but she wanted to get out of that place like immediately.
I could see, from her voice and from her sound that she was scared for something.
Something was about to happen. She knew it was going to happen.
She's thinking that she's going to die
Ajaib says he could have never imagined his sister's dark premonitions would come true.
A little after 9 o'clock, I called her, and I called her 2 or 3 times. There was no answer. Then I thought maybe she's gone to bed. I did not know what happened to my relatives.
But if the massacre of this family was really part of a coordinated hit by Satinder Bhatia, why did he let Gurpreet Singh live?
He's still on their radar. Gurpreet's response when he was asked for that whole gunshot residue test made them wonder, maybe they do need to look into him a little bit further.
And when investigators ask Ajaib about Gurpreet, he admits he too had noticed some strange behavior from his niece's husband.
He conveys to investigators that Gurpreet actually was acting strange since these murders occurred.
Gurpreet, since the murders, has not reached out to any of his deceased wife's family, which is very unusual in their community.
I'm not finding, but traditionally back in India, when wife dies, husband or husband's family contacts wife's immediate relatively right away.
I had to cremate them, I had to arrange everything. I had to go to the place where I did not know anyone. That was awful. No brother should see a day where he has to cremate 2 sisters and a niece.
However, despite Gurpreet's strange behavior, Ajaib says he doesn't think his niece's husband is capable of gunning down his own family.
To do this thing, the gruesome murder, I don't think he can do it.
After their interview with Ajaib, detectives reach out to other members of the local Sikh community to learn more about Satinder Bhatia. But their lead quickly loses steam.
They didn't believe that Satinder would have enough connection, enough pull to reach the family here in the United States.
The community did acknowledge that there is some corruption in India, but to plan a quadruple murder in the United States takes some significant reach.
However, friends of the family offer up another potential motive, one that could flip the entire case on its head.
It was very well known in the Sikh community that Gurpreet was having an affair.
If this extramarital affair is true, now Gurpreet has a motive to murder his wife.
Ohio investigators have just learned that 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh was having an affair in the months leading up to his wife Shalinderjeet Kaur's death.
It was very well known in the Sikh community that Gurpreet was having an affair.
There were other friends who said that they were aware of the affair, and the implication was always that the affair was something that Shalinderjeet knew about.
Where have you been?
I was just working on my truck.
We were advising Shalinderjeet to leave, and she would not leave.
She never left Gurpreet because she don't want to ruin the life of the kids.
Who is she, Gurpreet? Don't lie to me.
I'm telling the truth. There's nobody else.
Nobody in the community could give detectives the name of the person, but if this extramarital affair is true, now Gurpreet has a motive to murder his wife.
Hoping to get some definitive answers, detectives subpoena Gurpreet's phone records and discover that he has been in regular communication with a woman named Jasmeet Beatty.
She was a woman who lived in Indianapolis, and she had been divorced in 2018.
Indianapolis is one of the stops that Gurpreet often makes on his truck route.
When detectives reach out to Jasmeet, she seems shocked and saddened by the circumstances of their call.
I just can't believe this. Gurpreet must be devastated.
She confirms that she and Gurpreet are very good friends. She met Gurpreet through a relative who's also a truck driver, and when he's in the Indianapolis area, they meet up, but there's nothing more than that.
Has the relationship ever been romantic in nature?
With Gurpreet? No, of course not.
She said she does not have any type of sexual relationship with Gurpreet.
We're just friends.
Friends that have a lot of contact over the phone, it seems.
When detectives continue pressing her about her relationship with Gurpreet, she finally starts to cave and tell them the truth.
Okay, fine.
She just breaks down and tells them everything. That, yes, she was having an affair with Gurpreet.
She's coming clean. She says he spends a lot of money on me, and we're talking lavish gifts. $20,000 for a down payment on a home, paying the mortgage, buying a vehicle for her.
He's always there when I need him.
Perhaps most shocking of all, Jasmeet tells detectives that Gurpreet had bought his own home in Indianapolis, just down the road from hers.
He bought a house near her so that he can stay near her when he is in town driving his truck.
So while his wife's family, and the children were living in a very cramped apartment, Gurpreet's mistress was living a life of luxury.
He's actually planning to move here full time.
Jasmeet told investigators that Gurpreet had planned to move his family to Indianapolis to be closer to her while still basically living this double life.
Based on everything detectives have learned, it certainly sounds like Gurpreet had reason to want Shalinderjeet and his in-laws out of the picture.
However, Jasmeet assures investigators there's no way Gurpreet could have committed the murders.
Gurpreet is a kind, loving man. He would never kill his family.
She says she can't imagine him doing such a thing.
But after speaking with Jasmeet, detectives uncover even more information pointing towards Gurpreet.
Gurpreet was furious with his father-in-law, Hakikat.
Their dispute centered around the gas station business they'd started together, a business that eventually tanked.
It was a complete failure, and Gurpreet blamed that on Hakikat.
Gurpreet believed his father-in-law owed him a large sum of cash.
Gurpreet said he was out $100,000.
I want my money. How you can't say that? We made these decisions together.
Part of the reason Hakikat had gotten involved with Satinder Bhatia was in an attempt to pay back Gurpreet.
Gurpreet always wanted that money. So he pressured Hakikat to sell that property so he can get all that money.
Witnesses claimed that Gurpreet had actually beaten Hakikat during one of their arguments about the funds.
Gurpreet was cheating on his wife, and his father-in-law owed him a large sum of cash. This was sufficient reasons to murder everyone.
And when the results of Gurpreet's gunshot residue test come in, they're the nail in his coffin.
That test revealed the presence of gunshot residue on both of Gurpreet Singh's hands.
What it means is he fired a gun.
The evidence is enough for investigators to obtain an arrest warrant for Gurpreet on 4 counts of aggravated murder. However, when police go looking for their suspect, they run into a problem.
Gurpreet is nowhere to be found.
There was some concern that he might be fleeing the United States.
By July of 2019, Ohio police have zeroed in on 36-year-old Gurpreet Singh for the brutal quadruple murder of his wife, Shalinderjeet Kaur, and her family members.
This was a violent crime, the likes of which the community had never seen before. When everyone realized Gurpreet had done this to his own family, it was stunning.
It has affected us tremendously. It's hard to describe how bad it has affected us. We were really shocked.
Now, police are ready to arrest Gurpreet for the crime. But there's just one problem.
Gurpreet is nowhere to be found, and neither are his children.
Weeks go by. But finally, thanks to tips from the local Sikh community, detectives learn that Gurpreet has moved out of Ohio in the wake of the murders.
By that time, he had moved his children to the house that he had built and purchased in Indianapolis.
The same house that was just down the street from his mistress, Jasmeet.
Homicide.
But when detectives coordinate with their counterparts in Indianapolis to make an arrest, Gurpreet disappears again.
What do you mean he's not there?
There was some concern that he might be fleeing the area, and so law enforcement wanted to arrest him before he'd have an opportunity to leave the United States.
Thankfully, on July 2nd, 2019, more than 2 months after the murders, Ohio police finally receive a solid tip about Gurpreet's whereabouts.
Investigators learned that Gurpreet is in Connecticut for a family wedding.
Put your hands up! He was arrested just outside a shopping center in Connecticut.
But once he's in police custody, Gurpreet refuses to say anything more to detectives.
Gurpreet did not make any statements one way or the other to police. And he hasn't really said a word about this case since then.
Let's go. Regardless, investigators charge him with 4 counts of aggravated murder.
After more than 3 years of COVID-19 pandemic delays, Gurpreet's trial begins in October 2022. Prosecutors seek the death penalty, arguing Gurpreet's motive was twofold: eliminating his wife for another woman, and anger at his father-in-law over money.
Gurpreet was having trouble keeping up the elaborate double life he'd created for himself.
All that time demanding money, more and more money. His greed continued to go on and on and on.
To Gurpreet's dismay, his mistress, Jasmeet Beatty, takes the stand to bolster the prosecution's case.
She confirmed that she was in a relationship with Gurpreet, and he was spending thousands and thousands of dollars on her.
According to prosecutors, on April 28, 2019, Gurpreet's dire situation reached a tipping point.
Gurpreet was getting desperate. He was running out of money, and if he didn't do something soon, this secret double life he'd built would be exposed.
Prosecutors argue that Gurpreet plotted the murders carefully, first making arrangements for the children to spend the evening with relatives.
Hey, can I drop off the kids with you for a little while?
Then he went to do some work on his truck in an effort to establish an alibi.
Prosecutors said when he got home after working on his truck at 9 p.m., that he just unleashed fury on his family.
The prosecution actually created a 3D model to illustrate the carnage that had happened inside that apartment.
When Gurpreet arrived home at 9 p.m., he went straight to the back bedroom where Haqiqat was sleeping.
They believe that because of the dispute that he had with him, that he was the first victim in the bedroom.
He never got out of bed. He was asleep and never saw or heard the first shot coming.
6 of those bullets went into the head of Haqiqat. It speaks to a level of rage and a level of anger.
After his father-in-law was dead, prosecutors say Gurpreet returned to the living room where Parmjeet and Amarjeet had been watching TV.
Investigators believe they had been trying to flee when Gurpreet shot them. They must have heard the shots from the bedroom and knew something was wrong.
Lastly, Gurpreet made his way to the kitchen where his wife had been cooking dinner.
She must have heard everything else that happened and been completely terrified. No one saw this coming.
Gurpreet, what have you done?
This was a very personal, this was a very angry, this was a very cold, calculated murder. His own wife had a double tap entry wound to her skull.
After gunning down his family, Gurpreet knew he needed to get rid of the murder weapon and disposed of it in a nearby pond.
The neighbor described shortly after hearing gunfire a loud splash coming from the pond behind the apartment complex.
After Gurpreet's arrest, investigators searched the pond by the apartment complex and located a 9mm handgun.
The forensic scientists were able to conclusively demonstrate that the gun that was found in the pond was the gun that was used to kill all 4 of these people.
After he got rid of the weapon, Gurpreet started setting up his alibi.
He then calls 911, says he has happened upon this crime scene, and from the very beginning, he started a series of lies.
Help me, please!
The 911 call was received at approximately 9:45 p.m. And on that call, Gurpreet Singh that he just got home and had called 911 immediately. What we later learned was he had been home since about 9:09 p.m., 30 minutes prior to calling 911.
We also looked at the victims' devices that were found in the residence, and they were using their phones basically until Mr. Singh came home. So we knew that they were alive in the apartment until shortly after he came home.
Although their case is largely circumstantial, prosecutors feel confident the evidence is enough to convict Gurpreet.
All of the evidence very clearly demonstrated that it was Gurpreet and Gurpreet alone who pulled the trigger.
So the entire courtroom is shocked when the jury returns after 2 days of deliberation, hopelessly deadlocked.
11 jurors believed his guilt had been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but one particular juror would not be convinced, regardless of what the other jurors told her.
We were expecting that it's a clear-cut case, but it was a mistrial, and it was really shocking.
We just could not believe that how can somebody not convict in this situation when everything pointed to him.
Prosecutors refused to let Gurpreet off the hook that easily, though.
In May 2024, they take him to trial for a second time.
This time, Gurpreet opts for the case to be presented to a panel of 3 judges rather than a jury.
In this instance, the 3-judge panel unanimously agreed that the defendant, Gurpreet Singh, was guilty of the aggravated murder of these 4 people.
He was sentenced to death as the ultimate outcome.
For the family of the victims, it's an overwhelming moment.
That moment when the judge said that, we all were crying because we tried to fight for them. They deserve justice, and they got it.
It was unbelievable. Finally, we got justice.
Still, the outcome doesn't take away from the senselessness of this tragedy.
The bottom line is sex and money. That's why he committed it.
To do this and then lie about it and carry on a relatively normal life afterwards, it really just speaks to the sick mind and heart of somebody who could do something like that.
This was a family of kind-hearted, hard-working immigrants who didn't remotely deserve what happened to them.
It's unimaginable. It's hard for us to take this loss. And I miss them. Up to today, I miss them.
There are moments in politics when power changes hands in a room full of applause, cameras, and confident smiles. And then there are moments when, years later, investigators look back at that same room and see something entirely different. In January 2019, Larry Householder returned to one of the most powerful positions in the state of Ohio. He became Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives. For the cameras, it was a political comeback. For his supporters, it was proof that a man once pushed aside had found his way back to power. But behind that victory was a story that would eventually lead federal agents to his door. A story involving secret money, political ambition, powerful energy interests, hidden organizations, and a law worth roughly $1 billion. And at the center of it all was a question that sounds almost too simple to explain the scale of what happened. How much is political power worth when someone is willing to buy it? To understand what happened to Larry Householder, you have to go back before the handcuffs, before the courtroom, before the headlines described one of the largest public corruption scandals in Ohio history. You have to go back to the money. Beginning around 2017, according to federal prosecutors, millions of dollars began moving through a non-profit organization called Generation Now. On paper, it was not Larry Householder's campaign committee. It was a 501(c)(4) organization, a type of non-profit that can engage in certain political activities while generally offering the public less visibility into its donors than traditional campaign organizations. Behind that structure, prosecutors said, was something far more calculated. Between approximately March 2017 and March 2020, nearly $61 million connected to First Energy flowed into the network surrounding Householder and Generation Now. It moved through layers, organizations, political campaigns, advertisements, and people whose roles would only become clear after federal investigators began pulling the system apart. At first glance, political money can look like numbers on a spreadsheet. But numbers have consequences. $250,000 arriving again and again can become advertisements. Advertisements can become elections. Elections can become legislators. Legislators can become votes. Votes can become laws. And laws can move billions of dollars. That was the mechanism prosecutors said they uncovered. Householder's ambition, according to the federal case, was not limited to winning one election. The larger goal was to build a political bloc powerful enough to put him back in the speaker's chair and keep him there. Money was allegedly used to support candidates who were expected to support Householder. During the 2018 election season, more than $1 million was spent in the fall alone, much of it on negative advertising aimed at political opponents. The strategy worked. Candidates supported by the network won seats in the Ohio House. Once inside, they became part of the political equation that helped Householder secure the speakership in January 2019. And then came House Bill 6. HB 6 was not an obscure piece of legislation that would disappear into the archives of a state house. It concerned Ohio's energy policy and included a financial rescue package of approximately $1 billion designed to support two struggling nuclear power plants. For First Energy, the stakes were enormous. If the plants closed, the company faced potentially devastating financial consequences. If the legislation passed, the economic benefits could be measured in extraordinary sums. That meant HB 6 was more than a bill. It was the point where political power and corporate interest allegedly met. Federal prosecutors would later argue that the money flowing through Generation Now was part of a corrupt bargain, financial support for Householder's political operation in exchange for official actions that benefited energy interests. But after HB 6 became law in 2019, the danger was not over yet. There was another threat. The people of Ohio could attempt to challenge the law through a ballot referendum. If enough signatures were collected, voters could be given the opportunity to overturn HB 6. For the Householder network, prosecutors alleged, protecting the law became just as important as passing it. Money was spent fighting the referendum effort. Millions more moved through political operations. According to prosecutors, the network even paid $15,000 to obtain inside information about how many signatures opponents had gathered. Investigators also alleged that people collecting signatures were offered $2,500 in cash, along with travel expenses, if they would stop their work. The alleged objective was brutally straightforward. Pass the law. Then make sure the public could not easily take it back. And while that political machine was operating, prosecutors said, some of the money was also being used for Householder's personal benefit. More than $500,000 from the network was allegedly spent on personal expenses, including credit card debt, repairs to a Florida home, and the resolution of a business lawsuit. The machinery was becoming harder to separate from the man at its center. But the public still did not know the full story. Then, on July 21, 2020, the silence ended. Federal agents moved. Larry Householder was arrested. The arrest was not isolated. Investigators simultaneously charged other figures connected to the alleged operation, including former Ohio Republican Party Chairman Matthew Borges, longtime householder strategist Jeffrey Longstreth, lobbyist and former Republican House Budget Director Neil Clark, and lobbyist Juan Cespedes. Generation Now itself was also named in the case. The image was difficult to reconcile with the one Ohio had seen months earlier. The Speaker of the House, a man who had once commanded the legislative chamber, was now facing federal charges. The allegations described something larger than an individual bribe. Prosecutors called it a criminal enterprise, one that had allegedly moved approximately $60 million, later calculated at nearly $61 million, through a political network designed to acquire influence, pass legislation, and protect it from repeal. As the investigation continued, pieces of the structure began to collapse. Longstreth and Cespedes pleaded guilty to participating in the racketeering conspiracy. Longstreth admitted that he helped organize Generation Now for Householder and knew the organization was being used to receive bribe money. He also admitted involvement in transactions intended to conceal where the money came from. In 2021, Generation Now itself pleaded guilty. That same year, FirstEnergy entered a deferred prosecution agreement with the United States Department of Justice and agreed to pay $230 million in penalties related to the bribery conspiracy. The scandal was no longer confined to Ohio politics. It had become a national example of how corporate money, lobbying, dark money organizations, elections, and government policy could intersect. But the ultimate test would come in court. In January 2023, Larry Householder stood trial in federal court. For roughly 6 weeks, prosecutors presented their case. They introduced more than 1,000 exhibits and called 25 witnesses. They described a system that had allegedly been built piece by piece, payment by payment, election by election. On March 9, 2023, the jury reached its verdict. Larry Householder was found guilty of racketeering conspiracy. Matthew Borges was also convicted. For Householder, the political comeback that had once placed him at the top of Ohio's legislature had ended in a federal conviction. Then came the sentence. On June 29, 2023, Larry Householder was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, the maximum sentence allowed for the racketeering offense for which he was convicted. A man who had once presided over the Ohio House was taken into the custody of the United States Marshals. But the sentence did not erase the question that had been hanging over the entire case. What happens when the machinery of democracy becomes something that can be financed, controlled, and manipulated behind closed doors? Because the most disturbing part of the Householder scandal was never simply the size of the number. $61 million is difficult to imagine. But the chain it allegedly created is much easier to understand. Money entered a political network. The network helped candidates win. Those candidates helped Householder gain power. Power helped move HB 6. HB 6 delivered enormous potential benefits to energy interests. Then more money was used to fight the referendum that threatened the law. And somewhere inside that chain, according to prosecutors and the jury's verdict, political power became a commodity. That is what makes this story more than the downfall of one politician. It is a story about the distance between what voters can see and what can happen behind the walls of a state capitol. It is about a law written in public, and a system of influence alleged to have been built in private. And it is about a man who returned to power in 2019 believing, at least publicly, that he had won a political victory. 2 years later, federal agents would arrive. The cameras would turn. The handcuffs would close. And Ohio would discover that behind one of its most important pieces of legislation was a hidden story of money, ambition, and power that had been growing for years. Ohio, power, and the politics of influence. Before Larry Householder became the face of one of the largest political corruption scandals in modern Ohio history, there was another character in this story that mattered just as much as any politician. It was the place itself. Ohio. A state stretched between the industrial cities of the north, the rolling farmland of the west, the Appalachian foothills in the southeast, and the vast political machinery concentrated in Columbus. From a distance, Ohio can look like ordinary America. Quiet towns. Factory buildings. Church steeples rising above residential streets. Two-lane roads disappearing into fields. Gas stations glowing beneath fluorescent lights long after sunset. But beneath that familiar landscape was a political system where decisions made inside a few government offices could affect millions of people, and where the difference between a successful business deal and a financial disaster could sometimes depend on a single vote inside the Ohio State House. This was the world Larry Householder knew. And by 2017, he was preparing to return to its center. Columbus is not Washington. There are no marble monuments stretching for blocks in every direction. No White House. No Capitol dome dominating the national skyline. But inside the Ohio State House, the machinery of power is real. Bills are drafted. Lobbyists walk the corridors. Lawmakers negotiate behind closed doors. Political alliances are formed and broken. And somewhere between the public speeches and the private conversations, decisions are made that ordinary citizens may not fully understand until years later. Energy policy was one of those decisions. And in Ohio, energy was never simply about electricity. It was about jobs. Factories. Tax revenue. Utilities. Coal. Natural gas. Renewable energy. Nuclear power. Environmental regulation. Corporate survival. And billions of dollars. That was the landscape into which House Bill 6 would eventually emerge. But before HB 6 became a law, before federal prosecutors described an alleged $61 million criminal enterprise, and before FBI agents arrived at Larry Householder's home on a summer morning in 2020, something much quieter had been happening. Money was moving. Not in suitcases carried through dark parking lots. Not in dramatic exchanges caught on camera. The money moved through bank accounts. Organizations. Political networks. Consultants. Advertisements. Campaign operations. And a non-profit organization called Generation Now. The transactions could look ordinary when viewed one at a time. But when investigators eventually placed them side by side, they appeared to form something much larger. A system. To understand why that system mattered, it is necessary to understand the politics of energy in Ohio. For decades, Ohio had relied on a complicated mix of energy sources. Coal had deep roots in the state's industrial history. Natural gas was increasingly important. And nuclear power represented another enormous piece of the electricity puzzle. By the late 2010s, however, 2 nuclear plants operated by First Energy Solutions were struggling financially. The plants were known as the Davis-Besse Nuclear Power Station and the Perry Nuclear Power Plant. Both were enormous facilities. They were also enormously expensive to operate. And their future had become uncertain. If the plants closed, the consequences would not be limited to the company that owned them. There would be workers. Communities. Local governments. Suppliers. Electricity markets. And political pressure. The nuclear industry argued that the plants provided reliable electricity and that their closure could have consequences for the state's energy system. Critics argued that Ohio consumers should not be forced to subsidize aging nuclear facilities that could no longer compete economically. It was a familiar political battle. But by the middle of the decade, the stakes were becoming much higher. First Energy needed help. And the Ohio legislature had the power to provide it. This is where Larry Householder's story begins to change. Householder was not a political newcomer. He had already served as Speaker of the Ohio House once before, from 2001 to 2004. He understood the institution. He knew how committees worked. He knew how legislation moved. He understood that political power was rarely created by one person acting alone. It was built through relationships, alliances, loyalty, and votes. After leaving the Speaker's office, Householder remained an influential figure in Ohio politics, even though his career had moved through periods of controversy and political difficulty. Then came the years leading toward 2019. Householder wanted the speakership again. That meant winning elections. But winning elections was only the beginning. He needed allies inside the Ohio House. And allies needed to win their own races. This was where the alleged political operations surrounding Householder became important. According to federal prosecutors, money began flowing into Generation Now beginning in 2017. The organization was structured as a 501(c)(4). To the average voter, that designation meant very little. But in political circles, such organizations could be powerful. They could engage in certain political activities while operating outside the traditional structure of a candidate's campaign committee. And, crucially, the public did not necessarily see the true source of every dollar in the same way they might with a conventional political campaign. That made them useful. And according to prosecutors, Generation Now became the financial engine behind Householder's political ambitions. Imagine an election night in Ohio in 2018. The sun has disappeared beyond the horizon. Campaign signs are still planted along roads. Television screens glow inside homes and campaign offices. Numbers appear on computer monitors. District by district, the results come in. For the voters, each race may seem like an individual contest. Candidate against candidate. Republican against Democrat. Incumbent against challenger. But according to the federal case, there was another way of looking at those races. Each successful candidate could become another vote in the future battle for Speaker. One seat. Then another. Then another. And eventually, enough seats could form a majority. That is the mathematics of political power. One vote does not look like much. But dozens of votes can determine who controls the chamber. And who controls the chamber can determine which bills receive attention, which bills stall, and which bills eventually reach the governor's desk. According to prosecutors, Generation Now spent more than $1 million during the fall of 2018, much of it on attack advertisements targeting political opponents. The advertisements were not necessarily about Householder himself. That was part of what made the strategy so effective. Politics can operate indirectly. You do not always need to tell voters whom to support. Sometimes you only need to convince them whom not to support. A television screen. A serious voice. A photograph of a candidate. A carefully selected sentence. A warning about what might happen if the wrong person wins. Then another advertisement. And another. The voter sees the message. The campaign absorbs the impact. And somewhere behind the scenes, the money continues moving. By the time the 2018 election was over, several Householder-backed candidates had won. The political equation was changing. Householder's return was becoming possible. Then came January 2019. Inside the Ohio House, lawmakers gathered. The Speaker's race was decided. Larry Householder returned to the position he had once held more than a decade earlier. He was Speaker again. For Householder, it was a political comeback. For prosecutors, it was something else. They would later argue that the speakership was not simply the result of political ambition. They argued that it was one stage in a much larger plan. The alleged sequence was simple enough to describe. Money helped candidates. Candidates won. Winning candidates entered the House. Those lawmakers supported Householder. Householder became Speaker. And once he was Speaker, legislation favorable to the interests funding the operation could move forward. It was a chain. But every chain depends on every link. And if any link breaks, the entire structure can collapse. At the beginning of 2019, none of that was visible to the public. There was no flashing warning sign over the Ohio State House. No alarm sounded. The building looked much as it always had. Lawmakers came to work. Staff members carried folders through hallways. Lobbyists scheduled meetings. Reporters followed political developments. Outside, traffic moved through Columbus. People went to work. Children went to school. Restaurants opened. The state continued living its ordinary life. And inside the government, one of the most consequential political battles in Ohio was beginning. The nuclear plants were running out of time. First Energy had already warned that without financial assistance, the facilities could become economically unsustainable. The company had enormous financial interests at stake. For a corporation, this was not an abstract policy discussion. It was survival. If the plants closed, billions of dollars could be lost. If they remained open under a subsidy, the financial equation could change dramatically. That meant HB 6 was potentially worth an enormous amount of money. And the people who could influence that legislation possessed enormous value. This is one of the fundamental realities of political corruption cases. The bribe is rarely about the politician as an individual. The money is about access, influence, decision-making power. A politician who can change the direction of $1 billion policy is not merely a politician. In the eyes of a corporation, that person can become an economic asset. And according to federal prosecutors, that was precisely the relationship they believed existed between First Energy-related money and Householder's political operation. There was another important detail. The alleged payments did not arrive as one enormous transfer labeled HB 6. Instead, according to prosecutors, payments of approximately $250,000 per quarter began flowing into Generation Now around March 2017. Quarter after quarter. Money entering an organization. Money being distributed. Political activity taking place. Candidates receiving support. And, eventually, legislation moving. That pattern mattered. Because a single payment can be explained away. A political donation can be described as support. A consulting payment can be described as professional work. An advertisement can be described as ordinary political activity. But when investigators examine years of transactions, they can ask a different question. What happened before the money? What happened after the money? And who benefited? That is where financial investigations become less about individual transactions and more about patterns. The pattern prosecutors presented was built around Generation Now. The organization became the middle layer. First Energy-related money went in. Political operations came out. The organization could support candidates, pay for advertisements, finance political activity, and, prosecutors alleged, serve as a mechanism for concealing the true source and purpose of the money. That concealment was central to the case. Because if voters had known that tens of millions of dollars connected to an energy company were flowing through a political network supporting candidates who would later vote on legislation benefiting the energy industry, the political consequences could have been enormous. Transparency changes perception. Perception changes elections. And elections change power. The alleged system therefore depended not only on money. It depended on distance. The farther the money traveled from its original source, the harder it became for an ordinary voter to see the connection. First energy. Then another entity. Then Generation Now. Then political advertising. Then candidates. Then the Ohio House. Then the Speaker. Then legislation. By the time the final vote occurred, the original source of the money could be difficult for the public to see. But investigators would later reconstruct the path. Meanwhile, House Bill 6 was taking shape. The legislation was complex. Energy policy rarely fits neatly into a 30-second political advertisement. There were provisions dealing with nuclear power. There were renewable energy provisions. There were changes affecting Ohio's energy policy. But at the center of the controversy was financial assistance for the struggling nuclear plants. Approximately $1 billion. That figure is difficult to visualize. It is not a stack of money sitting inside a vault. It is a stream of payments, rates, subsidies, programs, and future obligations spread across years. But politically, the number represented something enormous. For First Energy, it could mean survival. For Ohio consumers, it meant questions about who would ultimately pay. For lawmakers, it meant choosing a side in a deeply contested energy debate. And for the political network surrounding Householder, according to prosecutors, it represented the payoff at the end of the strategy. There was an irony in the situation. The legislation could be discussed publicly as energy policy. That was how most citizens encountered it. They saw debates about electricity. They heard arguments about nuclear power. They listened to politicians defend or criticize the bill. But behind the public language was another question. Who had paid to create the political environment in which this bill could pass? That question would eventually become the center of a federal criminal prosecution. But in 2019, the answer was still hidden behind organizations, campaign spending, and political relationships. The system was working. At least for the moment. Householder had the speakership. His allies held seats. HB 6 was moving. And First Energy stood to receive enormous financial benefits. Yet there was one thing the political network had not fully accounted for. The voters themselves. Ohio's constitution gives citizens a mechanism to challenge legislation through a referendum. That meant passing HB 6 did not necessarily guarantee victory. Opponents could attempt to collect enough signatures to place the law before voters. If successful, they could force a public vote. And suddenly, the private political operation would face a very public threat. The legislature could pass the bill. But the people could potentially overturn it. For the Householder network, that changed the battlefield. The question was no longer simply, can HB 6 pass? The question became, can HB 6 survive? That distinction would become critical. Because according to federal prosecutors, the political spending did not stop once the legislation was passed. The network allegedly moved into another phase. A defensive phase. A phase in which money would be used to fight the referendum effort. And this is where the story begins to move from political influence towards something much darker. Picture the campaign workers gathering signatures. They stand outside stores. They move through neighborhoods. They speak to strangers. They hold clipboards. They explain the referendum. Some people sign immediately. Others ask questions. Some refuse. Some walk past without stopping. Every signature becomes a number. 10. 100. 1,000. 10,000. The campaign watches the total rise. For supporters of the referendum, those numbers represent momentum. For opponents, those same numbers represent danger. Because if enough signatures are collected, the law can be placed before voters. And suddenly, the entire billion-dollar policy could be at risk. According to prosecutors, members of Householders Network wanted to know exactly how far the signature campaign had progressed. The allegation was striking. $15,000 was paid to obtain information about the number of signatures collected. It was not merely political messaging. It was intelligence. Knowing the enemy's numbers meant knowing how much time remained. Knowing how close the referendum was meant knowing how much money might be necessary to stop it. And according to prosecutors, another strategy was even more direct. Signature gatherers were allegedly offered $2,500 in cash plus airfare expenses if they stopped working. The implication was unmistakable. Do not collect signatures. Stop the referendum before voters ever get the chance to decide. The political machine had reached a new stage. At first, it had been about winning elections. Then it became about controlling legislative power. Then about passing HB 6. And now it was allegedly about protecting the law from the people who wanted to challenge it. The circle was closing. Money had helped create political power. Political power had helped produce legislation. And legislation was now being defended with more political money. But there was still another layer. Where was Householder himself in all of this? According to federal prosecutors, he was not simply an observer. They alleged that more than $500,000 from the network was ultimately used for Householder's personal benefit. Credit card debt. Repairs to his Florida home. The resolution of a business lawsuit. These details were especially damaging because they changed the nature of the allegation. A politician could argue that campaign spending served a political purpose. A corporation could argue that lobbying served a legitimate business interest. But personal expenses were different. If political money was allegedly being converted into private benefit, the distance between public office and personal enrichment became much harder to explain. Still, nothing had exploded. Not yet. There were no federal agents at the door. No handcuffs. No indictment. No courtroom. The political machine continued operating. The public continued watching the debate over HB 6. The legislature continued its work. And First Energy continued pursuing the outcome that mattered most to the company. Then, on July 17, 2019, House Bill 6 became law. The legislation had crossed the finish line. The nuclear plants would receive financial support. The political objective appeared to have been achieved. But the referendum threat remained. And the more investigators later examined the events surrounding HB 6, the more they would focus on the months and years that had come before the vote. The money. The candidates. The advertisements. The speakership. The legislation. The referendum campaign. And the people who appeared repeatedly at different points along the chain. For the public, the scandal would not truly become visible until a year later. On July 21, 2020, federal agents arrived. The political world of Ohio would wake up to a story that seemed almost impossible. A sitting Speaker of the Ohio House had been arrested. The federal government was accusing him of participating in a racketeering conspiracy involving approximately $60 million in payments. The investigation had been conducted quietly. For months, perhaps years, evidence had been collected. Bank records. Communications. Financial transactions. Political activity. witness testimony. And somewhere inside that enormous investigative file was the story of how a political comeback allegedly became a criminal enterprise. But that morning had not yet arrived. For now, the State House still stood. The legislature still functioned. The law still existed. And Larry Householder still occupied one of the most powerful political positions in Ohio. The machinery appeared intact. No one watching from outside could see the crack running through its foundation. But beneath the surface, investigators were already assembling the pieces. And once those pieces were finally brought together, the question would no longer be whether Larry Householder had accumulated political power. The question would be how he had accumulated it, and what that power had been purchased to accomplish. The answer would lead directly to HB 6. And eventually, to a federal courtroom. Part 3. The victims behind the power. The people of Ohio, the communities at risk, and the human cost of a political scheme. Before the FBI raid. Before the indictments. Before the courtroom lights and the federal prosecutors standing before a jury. There were people. People who had never heard of Generation Now. People who had never met Larry Householder. People who would never sit inside the Ohio State House. People who had no idea that millions of dollars were allegedly moving through a political network whose consequences would eventually reach into their lives. In a case like this, the word victim can be complicated. There is no single crime scene. No abandoned house with police tape around it. No body discovered in the darkness. No eyewitness describing a violent confrontation. The damage in a political corruption case can be quieter. It can appear as a number on a utility bill. A factory closing. A community losing jobs. A taxpayer wondering why a policy costs more than expected. A citizen wondering whether a vote still means what it is supposed to mean. And perhaps most importantly, it can appear as something almost invisible. The loss of trust. Because democracy depends on an assumption. That when citizens cast a vote, the result reflects a contest of ideas. Not a contest of hidden bank accounts. That when lawmakers enter a chamber, they are there to represent constituents. Not a private financial network. And that when a bill becomes law, the public can at least believe the process was legitimate. The Householder case would challenge all three assumptions. Ohio was more than a political map. To understand the human dimension of the case, you have to leave the State House. Leave the polished corridors. Leave the committee rooms. Leave the microphones and cameras. Drive outward. Past Columbus. Past the government buildings. Toward the towns where people work shifts. Toward communities where generations of families have depended on the same industries. In Ohio, energy policy is not an abstract subject. Electricity is part of daily life. It keeps hospitals operating through the night. It powers factories. It keeps grocery stores refrigerated. It heats homes in winter. It runs schools. It supports businesses. Behind every electrical outlet is an enormous industrial system that most people rarely think about. Power plants. Transmission lines. Workers. Engineers. Maintenance crews. Regulators. Utilities. Investors. And politicians. When one part of that system becomes financially unstable, the consequences can spread. That was one reason the future of the Davis-Besse and Perry nuclear plants became politically explosive. Thousands of people could potentially be affected directly or indirectly by decisions involving major energy facilities. Workers depended on the plants. Local economies depended on workers. Businesses depended on reliable electricity. And taxpayers were ultimately part of the larger financial equation. That made the nuclear debate intensely personal. For some Ohio residents, keeping the plants open meant protecting jobs. For others, forcing consumers to support economically struggling facilities felt unfair. There were no simple heroes and villains in that debate. There were competing interests, competing fears, competing visions of Ohio's future. And somewhere in the middle stood House Bill 6. The people who worked inside the plants. Imagine arriving at a nuclear power plant before sunrise. The sky is still dark. A security checkpoint waits ahead. Employees arrive in work clothes. Some carry lunch bags. Some have worked there for decades. The facility itself is enormous. Concrete structures. Pipes. Cooling systems. Control rooms. Warning signs. Security barriers. Everything designed around precision. A nuclear power plant is not something that can simply be switched on and forgotten. It requires constant maintenance. Constant monitoring. Highly trained personnel. And enormous amounts of money. For the workers inside, the facility is not a political symbol. It is a workplace. A paycheck. A mortgage payment. A child's tuition. A retirement plan. A family. That distinction matters. Because when politicians debate whether a plant should remain open, the consequences are not theoretical to the people who work there. If the plant closes, someone may lose a job. A family may have to move. A local business may lose customers. A town may lose tax revenue. Property values can be affected. Schools can feel the impact. The economic shock can spread outward. That was one reason supporters of nuclear subsidies argued that the plants needed assistance. But the same economic reality created an enormous financial incentive for the companies involved. The difference between closure and continued operation could be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Possibly more. And that is precisely why the political process surrounding HB 6 mattered so much. The other side of the argument. But there were also Ohio residents who looked at the situation differently. They saw struggling nuclear plants. They saw a government considering billions in financial support. And they asked a simple question. Why should ordinary consumers pay to keep these facilities operating? That question became part of the political fight. Critics of HB 6 argued that the legislation represented a bailout. Supporters argued that nuclear power was essential to Ohio's energy future. The debate became increasingly bitter. Advertisements appeared. Politicians took positions. Advocacy groups mobilized. The public was asked to choose between competing narratives. One side warned about economic consequences. The other warned about corporate welfare. And then came the referendum effort. Citizens were attempting to collect enough signatures to give Ohio voters a direct say over whether HB 6 should survive. This was not merely another political campaign. For the people collecting signatures, it was an attempt to use the state's constitutional process. They went door to door. They stood in public spaces. They approached strangers. They asked people to sign. Every signature represented a small act of participation. One person. One pen. One name. One decision. And according to federal prosecutors, the Householder Network wanted to stop that process. The signature gatherers. There is something almost mundane about collecting signatures. A clipboard. A stack of forms. A pen. A few words of explanation. No dramatic soundtrack. No armed confrontation. Just people talking to people. But political campaigns can become exhausting. A signature collector may spend hours outside in heat. or stand in the cold, or walk through neighborhoods, or approach people who do not want to hear the pitch. Some doors close. Some people ignore them. Others stop and listen. Then comes the signature. One more. Then another. The campaign counts. The organizers watch the numbers. The deadline approaches. And suddenly every signature matters. If enough are collected, the law can be challenged. If not, the campaign ends. According to the federal case, the householder network allegedly viewed these signature collectors as a threat significant enough to target. Prosecutors alleged that people were offered $2,500 plus travel expenses to stop collecting signatures. That detail would later become one of the most striking examples of how far the alleged operation was willing to go to protect HB6. Because the objective was no longer simply to persuade voters. It was allegedly to prevent the vote from happening at all. The citizen who never knew. Consider an ordinary Ohio voter. We can call her no particular name. She is not a politician. She does not know householder. She does not know the lobbyists. She has never heard of Generation Now. One afternoon, someone approaches her with a petition. They explain that the petition concerns HB6. She may have questions. She may already have an opinion. Perhaps she has seen an advertisement. Perhaps she has not. She takes the clipboard, reads the language, then signs. From her perspective, it is a small action. Maybe 30 seconds. But in a democracy, that 30 seconds matters. The signature is supposed to represent the citizen's decision. If the allegations are true, however, people working behind the scenes were trying to manipulate whether that signature could be collected in the first place. That is what makes the alleged conduct so important. The corruption was not confined to a room where politicians negotiated. It potentially reached into the mechanism through which ordinary citizens exercised political power. The hidden cost of dark money. The term, dark money, can sound abstract. Almost technical. But imagine what it means from the perspective of an ordinary voter. You turn on the television. An advertisement appears. It tells you that a politician is dangerous, or irresponsible, or dishonest, or that a particular law will save jobs. The advertisement has professional production, music, graphics, a serious narrator, a carefully chosen photograph. You may never think about who paid for it. You simply absorb the message. And then you vote. That is the power of political advertising. It does not need to tell you everything. It only needs to shape the information environment in which you make your decision. According to prosecutors, Generation Now spent enormous sums on such political activity. And the money allegedly originated from interests connected to First Energy. The voter, meanwhile, could be left looking only at the advertisement. The source was hidden behind layers. That distance mattered. Because if the public had known the full financial relationship, they might have interpreted the campaign differently. Transparency is not merely a bureaucratic principle. It can change how voters understand political messages. The candidates who became part of the machine. There was another group caught inside the story. The candidates. Some were Republicans running for seats in the Ohio House. They needed money. They needed advertisements. They needed political support. They needed volunteers. They needed their names in front of voters. Campaigning is expensive. A candidate can spend months knocking on doors and still lose because an opponent has more money for advertising. So when political support arrives, it can be extremely valuable. According to prosecutors, Householders Network directed significant resources toward candidates it believed would support him. Some won. Those victories changed the composition of the Ohio House. But this is where the story becomes complicated. A candidate can accept political support without necessarily understanding every financial relationship behind it. A lawmaker can vote for a speaker because of political loyalty without knowing the full financial architecture that helped produce that political environment. The householder case did not mean every politician who benefited from the network was necessarily part of the criminal conspiracy. The federal prosecution focused on specific defendants and specific conduct. That distinction is important, because corruption cases can cast a shadow over entire institutions. And not everyone standing inside the shadow is guilty of the crime. The Speaker's Office. Inside the Speaker's office, power becomes tangible. Phones ring. Staff members move between meetings. Calendars fill. Legislative priorities are discussed. Lobbyists request appointments. Lawmakers seek support for bills. Political allies ask for favors. Opponents attempt to block proposals. The Speaker is not an absolute ruler, but the position carries extraordinary influence over the direction of the House. For Larry Householder, returning to that office in 2019 was the culmination of years of political work. According to prosecutors, it was also the point at which the alleged political investment began producing its greatest return. Because the speakership meant access. It meant influence over legislative priorities. And it placed Householder in a position where he could help determine what happened to HB 6. The question at the center of the federal case was whether that power had been obtained through an illegal arrangement. The industry watching closely. While ordinary Ohioans watched the debate, the energy industry was watching something else. Numbers. Financial projections. Plant operating costs. Potential losses. The future of the nuclear facilities. For First Energy, the stakes were enormous. The company had invested heavily in infrastructure. Its plants represented billions of dollars in assets and future revenue. If they closed, the consequences could be severe. If legislation provided financial support, the economic picture could change. That made HB 6 more than a political bill. It was an economic lifeline. And according to prosecutors, First Energy-related entities were willing to spend enormous amounts to secure it. Nearly $61 million. That number would eventually become one of the most repeated figures in the entire case. But behind the number were thousands of transactions. Hundreds of decisions. Dozens of people. And a political strategy that allegedly stretched across years. The personal dimension. Then there was Larry Householder himself. To understand why his case mattered, it is necessary to understand what political power meant to him. Householder had already experienced the rise and fall of political influence. He had been Speaker before. He had left the position. He had returned. He knew what it felt like to control the agenda of one of the most important political institutions in Ohio. Power can become its own currency. The office gives access. Access creates relationships. Relationships create opportunities. And opportunities create more power. According to the federal prosecution, Householder wanted that power badly enough to build an organization around it. And the alleged use of more than $500,000 for personal expenses made the story even more personal. Credit card debt. Home repairs in Florida. A business dispute. These were not abstract political objectives. They were expenses connected to Householder's private life. The federal government would later argue that money entering the political operation was not simply being spent on elections and legislation. Some of it was allegedly reaching Householder's personal world. The family members watching from outside. Every political scandal eventually reaches families. Not because family members are responsible for the actions of a politician. They are not. But when federal agents arrive at someone's home, when cameras gather outside courthouses, when headlines appear with a familiar family name, the people closest to the accused are pulled into a world they did not create. They watch television coverage. They see photographs. They hear accusations repeated. They read statements from prosecutors. They hear defense attorneys challenge those allegations. And they are forced to live with the uncertainty of a case that can last years. For the victims of political corruption, the emotional damage can also be difficult to measure. A citizen may not know exactly how much a policy cost them. A worker may not know whether a political decision affected the future of their community. A voter may never know how much an advertisement influenced their choice. Corruption often leaves no single receipt labeled damage caused. Instead, it creates an atmosphere of doubt. And doubt can survive long after the verdict. The first crack. In the summer of 2019, HB 6 became law. For supporters, it was a victory. For opponents, it was a defeat that was not yet final. The referendum campaign continued. That was when the political battle became more intense. Money poured into campaigns. Opponents gathered signatures. The householder network fought back. The public saw advertisements. But beneath the surface, federal investigators were building their own picture. At the time, most Ohio residents did not know that the FBI was investigating the political network. They could not see the bank records. They could not hear the private conversations. They could not see the relationships prosecutors would eventually present to a jury. The investigation was moving in silence. That silence would make the eventual arrests even more shocking. The victims were not all on one side. One of the most important lessons of the householder case is that the people affected by the scandal cannot easily be divided into political categories. Republicans could be affected. Democrats could be affected. Nuclear workers could be affected. Environmental advocates could be affected. Consumers could be affected. Taxpayers could be affected. And ordinary citizens who simply wanted their government to operate honestly could be affected. The issue was larger than whether someone supported nuclear energy. It was larger than whether someone supported Larry Householder. It was larger than whether someone supported HB 6. The fundamental question was whether public power had been converted into private power. That is why the case resonated far beyond one bill. What happens when trust disappears? Imagine a citizen hearing that approximately $61 million had allegedly flowed through a political network. Then hearing that the network helped Householder regain the speakership. Then hearing that HB 6 provided roughly $1 billion in financial support. Then hearing that the same network allegedly spent money fighting the referendum effort. Then hearing that hundreds of thousands of dollars allegedly benefited Householder personally. The natural reaction is not necessarily anger. Sometimes it is something quieter. Disbelief. A pause. Then a question. Was any of this ever really about us? That question is devastating because democracy requires participation. People vote because they believe participation matters. They sign petitions because they believe their signatures matter. They contact representatives because they believe representatives will listen. They pay taxes because they believe government serves a public purpose. When a corruption scandal reveals that political decisions may have been influenced by hidden financial interests, those assumptions become fragile. The damage can therefore continue long after the defendants are sentenced. The State House after dark. Imagine the Ohio State House after most of the lights have gone out. The corridors are quieter. The offices are dark. The footsteps disappear. Outside, Columbus continues moving. Cars pass through intersections. Streetlights reflect off wet pavement. Somewhere in the city, people are preparing dinner. Someone is checking a utility bill. Someone is going to work the night shift. Someone is putting a child to bed. None of them knows what is coming. Inside the political system, however, the pieces are already in motion. The money has moved. The legislation has passed. The referendum fight is underway. The investigation is deepening. And the people who believe they control the situation have no idea that federal agents are closing in. For Larry Householder, the political world still appears intact. He is Speaker. He has allies. His legislation has passed. The network has achieved what it was allegedly created to achieve. But the most dangerous moment in a hidden operation is often not when the money changes hands. It is when someone begins asking questions. Where did the money come from? Where did it go? Who knew? Who benefited? Who gave the orders? And why? The questions begin to multiply. Investigators do not need to understand everything at once. They start with fragments. A payment. A bank transfer. A political advertisement. A communication. A meeting. Then another payment. Another advertisement. Another communication. Slowly, the fragments connect. A name appears more than once. Then another. An organization sits between transactions. Money moves through it. Political activity follows. And eventually investigators can begin drawing lines. First Energy. Generation Now. Householder. Political candidates. The Ohio House. HB 6. The referendum campaign. Personal expenditures. The pattern begins to look less like coincidence. And more like design. That was the picture federal prosecutors would later present. But before that picture could be presented in court, the investigation had to survive. Because the people being investigated were not powerless. They were politically connected. They had resources. They had lawyers. They had relationships. And they had every reason to believe that the political system around them could withstand scrutiny. Then came July 2020. And the silence ended. On the morning of July 21, 2020, the invisible investigation became visible. Federal agents moved against Larry Householder and others. The speaker's political career collapsed in a matter of hours. News organizations rushed to report the arrests. Ohio lawmakers were forced to respond. The public suddenly learned that federal prosecutors believed one of the state's most powerful politicians had been at the center of a massive corruption conspiracy. The man who had spent years building political power now faced the possibility of losing everything. His office. His freedom. His reputation. His political future. And eventually, 20 years of his life. But that was still ahead. At this point in the story, the most important thing to remember is the people who had been living on the other side of the political machine. The workers. The voters. The taxpayers. The signature collectors. The communities surrounding the nuclear plants. And the citizens who had trusted the institutions of their state government. They were not sitting in the FBI's briefing room. They were not reading the confidential documents. They were not watching investigators trace millions of dollars through bank accounts. They were simply living their lives. And while they did, an alleged political enterprise was using money to shape the government that represented them. The crime, if the allegations were true, did not happen in one dramatic moment. It unfolded slowly. One payment. One advertisement. One candidate. One vote. One law. One attempt to stop a referendum. One private benefit. One layer of secrecy after another. Until the distance between politics and money became almost impossible to see. And then, suddenly, the FBI made that distance disappear. The doors opened. The handcuffs came out. The cameras turned toward the Ohio State House. And a question that had been hidden for years finally became public. Who had really been running Ohio's political machinery? The answer would emerge through evidence. Through witnesses. Through financial records. Through thousands of pages of documents. And eventually, inside a federal courtroom, where Larry Householder would have to face the story that prosecutors said he had spent years trying to keep hidden. Part 4. The Incident. July 21, 2020, the morning the FBI came for the speaker. At first, it looked like an ordinary summer morning in Ohio. There was nothing in the sky announcing what was about to happen. No sirens racing through Columbus. No television warning interrupting breakfast programs. No public statement from the Ohio State House. Just another July morning. People getting into cars. Businesses opening their doors. Employees arriving for work. Traffic moving through the streets. And inside the political world of Ohio, Larry Householder was still the Speaker of the Ohio House of Representatives. Still powerful. Still surrounded by political allies. Still operating within the institution he had spent years trying to control. But somewhere outside the view of the public, federal agents were already moving. The investigation that had been developing quietly was about to become impossible to hide. On July 21, 2020, the federal government made its move. Larry Householder was arrested. So were several other people connected to the alleged political operation. And within hours, one of the most powerful politicians in Ohio had become the central figure in a federal criminal case. The allegations were staggering. A political network. A non-profit organization. Millions of dollars. Secret financial arrangements. Political campaigns. $1 billion energy bailout. Attempts to defeat a citizen referendum. And personal benefits allegedly flowing to the politician at the center of it all. The government described it as a racketeering conspiracy involving approximately $60 million. The number would later rise to nearly $61 million in the government's accounting. But the money was only the beginning. Because prosecutors were not saying Larry Householder had simply taken a bribe. They were saying something much larger had happened. They were saying that a political machine had been built. And that the machine had been designed to turn corporate money into political power. Then turn that political power into legislation. The knock on the door. We do not need to imagine the arrest as a movie scene. There is no need for shouting. No dramatic chase. No getaway car. The reality was more unsettling because of how ordinary it could look. Federal investigations often end not with an explosion, but with a knock. A door opens. Agents identify themselves. Documents are presented. The person inside realizes that the investigation they may have suspected, or hoped would never arrive, has arrived. For Householder, the federal case was no longer something happening somewhere in the background. It was standing in front of him. The United States government was accusing him of participating in a criminal enterprise. The man who had once occupied one of Ohio's most powerful political offices was now facing federal agents. And the machinery of his political career was beginning to break apart. The other arrests. Householder was not alone. Federal prosecutors also charged Matthew Borges, then a former chairman of the Ohio Republican Party. Jeffrey Longstreth, a longtime political strategist associated with Householder, was among those charged. So was Neil Clark, a lobbyist and former budget director for the Ohio House Republican Caucus. And Juan Cespedes, another lobbyist. Generation Now was also named in the case. This was important. The federal government was not presenting the allegations as the actions of one rogue politician. It was describing a network. A structure. Different people occupying different positions. Political strategist. Lobbyist. Organization. Politician. Corporate interests. Each person had a role. And together, prosecutors alleged, those roles created something resembling a criminal enterprise. That word, enterprise, would become central to the case. Because the government did not merely want to prove that someone had received money. It wanted to prove that an organized system existed for a specific purpose. The political shockwave. The news spread quickly. Ohio had seen political scandals before. But this was different. The Speaker of the Ohio House had been arrested by the federal government. Not after leaving office. Not years later. While still sitting at the center of state political power. The institution suddenly faced a crisis. How could the legislature continue functioning when its leader had been accused of using the office itself as part of a criminal scheme? Lawmakers had to respond. Political allies had to distance themselves. Reporters began searching through old statements. Opponents revisited decisions that had once seemed ordinary. Every connection was suddenly examined. Every political contribution raised questions. Every relationship acquired a different meaning. And the bill at the center of the scandal, HB 6, was suddenly transformed in the public imagination. It was no longer simply an energy law. It was evidence. Or at least, prosecutors would argue that it was the ultimate product of the alleged scheme. What the government said had happened. The federal indictment described a strategy that had allegedly begun years before Householder returned to the speakership. According to prosecutors, First Energy-related entities had provided money to Generation Now beginning around March 2017. The payments were allegedly about $250,000 every quarter. Quarter after quarter. The money entered the political network. The network supported candidates. Those candidates won elections. The lawmakers then helped Householder become Speaker. And once he had the power to shape the legislature, HB 6 moved forward. That was the government's theory. It was not a single exchange. It was a long-term arrangement. The prosecution would later describe the money as being used to build Householder's political power first. The energy legislation came afterward. That distinction mattered. Because if the money had been transferred only after the bill passed, the defense could argue that the payments were unrelated. But prosecutors were pointing backward. They wanted the jury to see the entire sequence. The money came first. The political power came next. Then the legislation. The First Energy connection. At the center of the financial allegations was First Energy. The company had an enormous economic interest in the future of Ohio's nuclear plants. Davis Bess. Perry. Two facilities facing serious financial pressure. If HB 6 became law, the plants would receive significant financial support. For First Energy, the potential value was enormous. That created the motive prosecutors believed explained the company's willingness to spend tens of millions of dollars. But the alleged arrangement was not presented as a simple corporate check written directly to Larry Householder. Instead, money traveled through Generation Now. That layer mattered. It created separation. First Energy-related funds could enter an organization that was not publicly branded as a Larry Householder campaign committee. The organization could then spend money on political activity. Candidates could receive support. Opponents could be attacked. Political power could be accumulated, and the public could have difficulty seeing the original source of the money. That was the alleged architecture. Corporate money, political organization, election spending, legislative power, energy legislation, financial benefit. Why Generation Now mattered. Generation Now was not simply a name on a bank account. It became one of the most important pieces of the entire prosecution. The organization operated as a 501(c)(4). That classification is not inherently criminal. Many legitimate organizations operate under similar structures. The important issue in the Householder case was how prosecutors said the organization was used. According to the federal government, Generation Now functioned as the financial vehicle for householders' political enterprise. Money came in. Political spending went out. The organization supported candidates. It funded campaigns against opponents. It participated in the battle surrounding HB 6. And, according to the government, some money was ultimately used for householders' personal benefit. The organization therefore sat directly between the corporate money and the political machine. And that made it essential to understanding the alleged conspiracy. The elections were not a side story. One of the most important elements of the federal case was the 2018 election. To someone watching from outside, the election might have appeared routine. Candidates ran. Advertisements aired. Voters cast ballots. Winners were announced. But prosecutors argued that the election was one of the central mechanisms of the alleged scheme. If Householder wanted to become Speaker, he needed lawmakers who would support him. And lawmakers needed to win their races. According to the government, the network therefore invested money in candidates who could become part of Householder's political bloc. More than $1 million was spent during the fall of 2018. Much of it on negative advertising against opponents. That money could change races. It could shape perceptions. It could influence voters. And when enough candidates won, the political balance inside the Ohio House changed. The result was not merely a collection of election victories. It was power. January 2019. Then came the moment Householder had been working toward. He became Speaker again. The political comeback was complete. Years after his first tenure as Speaker, Larry Householder was once again standing at the center of Ohio's legislative government. Photographs showed him surrounded by lawmakers. Reporters asked questions. The new Speaker began setting priorities. The institution moved forward. But according to prosecutors, another clock had already started. HB 6. The legislation would soon become the focus of intense lobbying. First Energy needed it. Opponents were preparing to fight it. And Householder was in a position to influence the process. The alleged political investment was now entering its most important stage. The bill. House Bill 6 was complicated enough to confuse anyone who did not follow Ohio energy policy closely. But its most important element for the federal case could be explained in a single concept. Financial support for nuclear power. The legislation created a system that would provide substantial financial assistance to struggling nuclear plants. The estimated value was around $1 billion. That number transformed the bill from a technical piece of legislation into a political battlefield. For supporters, it was about preserving nuclear generation. For critics, it was an expensive bailout. For First Energy, it could prevent the company's nuclear facilities from shutting down. For Householder, prosecutors alleged, it represented the policy objective around which the political network had been built. Behind the public debate. The public saw debates. Lobbyists saw strategy. Politicians saw votes. Corporations saw financial outcomes. Each group was looking at the same legislation from a different angle. That is normal politics. What was not normal, according to prosecutors, was the alleged hidden financial relationship connecting those interests. The federal government claimed that the money from First Energy-related entities was not simply paying for ordinary lobbying. It was allegedly financing the entire political structure necessary to make the desired legislation possible. That was a much more serious accusation. Because lobbying a legislator is legal. Supporting a candidate is legal. Running political advertisements is legal. Creating a non-profit organization is legal. Even advocating for controversial legislation is legal. The alleged criminal conduct emerged from how prosecutors said those activities were connected. The issue was not the individual pieces. It was the system. July 2019. After intense political maneuvering, HB 6 passed. The bill became law. For First Energy, it was a major victory. The nuclear plants had secured a financial lifeline. But the celebration was short-lived. Because opponents of HB 6 were not prepared to accept defeat. They turned to the referendum process. The law could still be challenged. If enough valid signatures were gathered, Ohio voters could potentially decide whether HB 6 should remain in place. The political battle therefore moved from the legislature to the streets. And that is where the allegations against the householder network became even more striking. The referendum threat. The referendum campaign needed signatures. A lot of them. That meant volunteers and paid workers had to approach Ohio voters. Every signature brought the campaign closer to its goal. For the householder network, according to prosecutors, the signature drive represented a serious threat. Because if voters were given the opportunity to overturn HB 6, the legislation that had taken so much political effort to pass could disappear. The government's case alleged that the network therefore began trying to disrupt the signature gathering process. One allegation involved a $15,000 payment for information about how many signatures had been collected. That meant someone inside the operation was allegedly trying to monitor the campaign's progress. How many signatures? How close were they? How much time remained? Those questions would determine how aggressively the opposition needed to be countered. The offer to stop. Then came the allegation that attracted even more attention. According to prosecutors, people involved in collecting signatures were offered $2,500 in cash plus airfare expenses if they stopped their work. Imagine being offered that money. You are standing somewhere in Ohio with a clipboard in your hands. Perhaps you have spent hours asking strangers to sign. Then someone offers you thousands of dollars to stop. It changes the nature of the political contest. You are no longer simply being persuaded. Someone is allegedly trying to remove your ability to participate. That allegation would later become part of the government's argument that the network was determined to protect HB 6 by whatever means necessary. The money that came home. But the alleged political operation had another destination. Householders' personal life. According to the Department of Justice, more than $500,000 from the network was used for his personal benefit. Some money allegedly went toward credit card debt. Some toward repairs at his Florida home. Some toward resolving a business lawsuit. Those details would later become particularly powerful in court. Because they gave prosecutors a way to show the jury that the alleged enterprise was not operating only for abstract political objectives. Money was allegedly being converted into personal advantages. The political network had a public purpose. But the man at its center allegedly benefited privately. That was the contradiction prosecutors wanted the jury to see. A system built in the name of political power was allegedly also funding the private life of the person who controlled it. July 2020. For almost 3 years, according to prosecutors, the network had operated. Money had moved. Candidates had won. Householder had returned to the speakership. HB 6 had passed. The referendum battle had erupted. Personal expenses had allegedly been paid. Then federal agents arrived. The arrests on July 21 did more than remove several people from the political landscape. They exposed the alleged structure. Suddenly, Generation Now was no longer an obscure political organization. It was evidence. The millions were no longer merely campaign spending. They were allegedly proceeds of a criminal enterprise. HB 6 was no longer simply energy policy. It was alleged to be the legislative payoff. And Larry Householder was no longer merely the speaker. He was the defendant at the center of one of the largest public corruption cases in Ohio history. The charges. The federal government accused Householder and the other defendants of participating in a racketeering conspiracy. At its heart was the allegation that money had been used to influence political decisions. But the case involved several layers of conduct. Bribery. Honest services fraud. Money laundering. Political manipulation. Concealment. And personal enrichment. The government's theory was that these acts were not isolated. They were connected. Each helped advance the larger objective. Money supported candidates. Candidates supported Householder. Householder controlled legislative power. Legislative power produced HB 6. Then the network fought to preserve the law. And all the while, prosecutors alleged, money was being hidden and some of it diverted for personal use. The structure resembled a business. Except its product was political power. The shock inside Ohio politics. The arrest forced lawmakers to confront an uncomfortable reality. The Speaker of the House had been accused of using political power as part of a criminal enterprise. That did not mean the entire Ohio legislature was corrupt. It did not mean every lawmaker involved in the 2019 speakership election was part of the conspiracy. But the scandal created a cloud over the institution. Questions began spreading. Who knew? Who did not know? Which candidates had received money? Who had spoken to Householder? Who had supported HB 6? Who had benefited? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question. How long had this been happening? The investigation had not finished. The arrests were not the end. They were the beginning of the public phase of the case. The government still needed to prove its allegations. An indictment is not a conviction. An accusation is not evidence of guilt by itself. Householder would have the right to defend himself. His attorneys would challenge the government's interpretation of the evidence. The jury would eventually have to decide what was proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And before that happened, prosecutors would need witnesses. Documents. Financial records. Communications. People who had been inside the operation. People who knew how Generation Now worked. People who could explain where the money came from. And people willing to tell the government what they knew. That process would begin to dismantle the political machine piece by piece. The first dominoes. When a complex conspiracy is exposed, the central defendant is rarely the first person to provide investigators with the full picture. Instead, the edges begin to collapse. One person pleads guilty. Another cooperates. Documents are produced. Emails are examined. Financial records are followed. A witness explains a conversation. Another witness confirms it. The government's case becomes stronger. And in the Householder scandal, that process began soon after the arrests. Jeffrey Longstreth. Juan Cespedes. Generation Now. Each would eventually plead guilty. Each plea would provide prosecutors with another piece of the alleged machine. The network that once depended on secrecy now faced a different problem. Too many people knew too much. The machine had started turning against itself. This is one of the most dangerous moments for any alleged criminal enterprise. When everyone is loyal, the system can remain silent. But once one person admits guilt, the balance changes. A defendant begins asking, what does the government know? What does the government have? What has someone else already told investigators? Did they record that conversation? Do they have the bank records? Do they have the emails? Do they have witnesses? And if another person has already pleaded guilty, what happens next? Trust disappears. Every participant becomes a potential witness. Every conversation becomes a potential piece of evidence. Every payment becomes something prosecutors can examine. The same network that had once connected people through money and political loyalty now connected them through criminal exposure. The beginning of the end. The arrest of July 21, 2020, therefore marked a turning point. But it did not answer the central questions. How did the money actually move? Who knew where it came from? What did Larry Householder know? What did he direct? What did he personally receive? How closely was the money tied to HB6? And what evidence could prove that the political relationships were not ordinary politics, but part of a criminal agreement? Those questions would dominate the years that followed. The government would bring witnesses into court. Bank records would be examined. Political communications would be presented. The defense would challenge the prosecution's interpretation. And slowly, the story that had existed in secret would be reconstructed in public. For Larry Householder, the morning of July 21 had changed everything. A political career built over decades was suddenly being measured against a federal indictment. The Speaker's office was no longer a symbol of his success. It had become part of the government's narrative. Generation Now was no longer merely a non-profit. It was alleged to be the financial vehicle of the enterprise. HB6 was no longer just an energy law. It was alleged to be the billion-dollar prize. And the nearly $61 million flowing through the network was no longer simply political money. It was now evidence. The machine had been exposed. But the most important evidence had yet to be heard. Because the government's case would eventually depend on people who had been close enough to the operation to explain what the money really meant. Some of them would plead guilty. Some would testify. Some would be confronted with their own words. And one by one, they would begin revealing how the machine had actually worked. The public had seen the arrests. Now it was time to see what had been happening behind the doors. And that story would begin with the people closest to the money. Part 5, The Investigation. Following the money, the messages, and the people who knew too much. The arrests had happened. The headlines had exploded across Ohio. Larry Householder, once one of the most powerful politicians in the state, was now facing the federal government. But an arrest does not explain a conspiracy. It only announces that investigators believe they have found one. Now came the difficult part. Proving it. Federal prosecutors had to take a story that had allegedly unfolded over several years and reconstruct it piece by piece. They needed to show where the money came from. Where it went. Who controlled it? Who knew about it? What political activity it financed? And, most importantly, whether all of those actions were connected by an agreement to exchange money for political power. This was no simple investigation. There was no single envelope containing a confession. No document saying, "Give us the money, and we will pass HB6. Instead, investigators had to assemble a mosaic. Bank records. corporate payments, political advertisements, emails, text messages, meetings, witnesses, campaign expenditures, financial transactions, and the testimony of people who had once been close to Larry Householder. The deeper investigators looked, the more the pieces appeared to connect. Following the money. Money leaves traces. Even when people try to disguise its origins, money has to move through accounts. Banks record transactions. Organizations keep records. Campaigns file expenditures. Credit card companies keep statements. Contractors issue invoices. Property repairs generate bills. A business dispute creates legal expenses. And when millions of dollars are involved, the paper trail can become enormous. Investigators followed the money connected to Generation Now. According to the government's case, beginning around March 2017, First Energy-related entities transferred approximately $250,000 every quarter into the organization. The payments continued. Quarter after quarter. Year after year. By the time the full picture emerged, the total was approaching $61 million. That was not an accidental accounting error. It was a financial pattern. And patterns are what investigators look for. One payment can be coincidence. 10 payments begin to look deliberate. Dozens of payments over several years raise a different question entirely. What was being purchased? The middleman. Generation Now was critical because it sat between the money and the politics. Imagine drawing the structure on a whiteboard. At the top. First energy-related money. Then an arrow downward. Generation Now. Another arrow. Political spending. Another. Candidates. Another. Ohio House. Another. Larry Householder. Then finally. HB6. But the real investigation was about the arrows. Who authorized them? Who communicated with whom? Who knew the purpose? Who controlled the organization? And what happened when the political objectives were achieved? The government alleged that Generation Now was effectively controlled by Householder's political operation. That would later become one of the most important questions in the case. Because if Generation Now was simply an independent advocacy organization, the prosecution's theory would look very different. But if it was a vehicle created to receive and spend money for Householder's political objectives, then its role became much more significant. The 2018 elections. Investigators examined the election spending closely. The timing mattered. The money flowed into Generation Now. Then Generation Now spent heavily during the 2018 election. More than $1 million was spent in the fall, much of it on negative advertising against candidates who opposed Householder's political ambitions. Investigators asked, who were those candidates? Who benefited from the spending? Who eventually won? And what happened after they arrived in the Ohio House? The answers helped establish the government's theory. The election was not an isolated event. It was part of a sequence. The political network spent money. Candidates benefited. Candidates won. Householder became Speaker. And then HB6 moved forward. The political mathematics. There is a cold logic to legislative politics. A speaker needs votes. If the chamber contains dozens of lawmakers, one person's support is not enough. You need a coalition. You need loyalty. You need people willing to stand with you when the vote comes. That is why campaign money can be so valuable. It can create relationships before lawmakers ever enter the legislature. According to prosecutors, Householder's operation allegedly understood this. Support candidates. Help them win. Build the caucus. Secure the speakership. Then use the position to advance policy. The strategy, if the government's allegations were true, was less like an ordinary campaign and more like constructing an organization. Each election added another piece. Each ally increased householders' leverage. And once enough pieces were in place, the speakership became possible. The conversations. Financial records could show money moving. But they could not necessarily explain intent. That required something else. Communications. Emails. Text messages. Phone calls. Meetings. Private conversations. The government needed to show what people actually knew. Did householder know where the money came from? Did he understand what Generation Now was doing? Did the other participants know? Was there an agreement? Was HB6 part of that agreement? Those questions became central. Because political activity can be aggressive without being criminal. A politician can support candidates. A non-profit can run advertisements. A company can lobby. A lawmaker can advocate for legislation. The government had to show the connection. The hidden bargain. The alleged exchange. Money in one direction. Political action in the other. The witnesses begin to matter. As the investigation progressed, several people in householders' orbit became increasingly important. Jeffrey Longstreth. Juan Cespedes. Others connected to the operation. These were not distant observers. They had been inside the political machinery. They knew how Generation Now functioned. They understood its financial relationships. And prosecutors would eventually use their admissions to help establish the government's narrative. Longstreth was particularly important. He had worked with Householder for years. He understood Ohio politics. He knew the mechanics of campaigns. And he was connected directly to Generation Now. When someone with that level of access admits involvement, the investigation changes. The government no longer has to reconstruct everything from outside evidence. It can ask questions from someone who was inside. Longstreth's decision. In October 2020, Jeffrey Longstreth pleaded guilty to participating in the racketeering conspiracy. That was a major development. A guilty plea does not automatically prove every allegation against another defendant. But it gives prosecutors something powerful. A participant acknowledging criminal conduct. Longstreth admitted that he had helped organize Generation Now for Householder. He admitted knowing that the organization was being used to receive money connected to the bribery scheme. And he admitted participating in transactions intended to conceal the source of the money. The machine was beginning to reveal itself from within. Juan Cespedes. Then there was Juan Cespedes. A lobbyist. Someone who understood how politics and government intersect. In October 2020, Cespedes also pleaded guilty to participating in the racketeering conspiracy. His plea added another layer. Another insider. Another person acknowledging that the network existed. Another set of facts prosecutors could use to explain the movement of money and political influence. When investigators have multiple participants admitting involvement, the central defendant faces a more difficult legal environment. Because the defense can attack one witness. It can challenge one person's credibility. It can argue that one participant is lying to reduce their own sentence. But when multiple people provide overlapping accounts, and when financial records independently support portions of those accounts, the prosecution's case can become much harder to dismiss. The guilty plea of Generation Now. Then came an unusual development. The organization itself pleaded guilty. In 2021, Generation Now admitted its role in the conspiracy. That mattered because the organization had been at the center of the money trail. It was the vehicle. The account through which millions flowed. The entity that financed political activity. The structure that prosecutors said helped conceal the money's origins. An organization cannot take the witness stand in the same way a person can. But its guilty plea represented another acknowledgement that the alleged financial structure was not simply a misunderstanding. Something criminal had occurred. The machine was collapsing from the inside. The First Energy investigation. But investigators did not stop with the political side. They followed the money back toward its source. First Energy was at the center of that inquiry. The company had enormous financial interests in HB6. And according to the federal investigation, money connected to First Energy had moved into the political network. The question became, what did company executives know? Who approved the payments? What did they expect in return? And how directly were those payments connected to the legislation? In 2021, First Energy entered into a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice and agreed to pay $230 million in penalties related to the bribery scheme. That was a staggering figure. But the number was not the most important part. The agreement demonstrated that the investigation had expanded beyond Ohio politics. This was now a corporate corruption case as well. Two worlds collide. The householder scandal brought together two worlds that normally operate separately. Politics and corporate finance. Each has its own language. Politicians talk about voters. Corporations talk about markets. Lobbyists talk about policy. Campaign consultants talk about messaging. Accountants talk about transactions. Lawyers talk about compliance. But in the alleged HB6 scheme, these worlds overlapped. Money from the corporate world entered a political network. The network helped build political power. Political power produced legislation. The legislation protected corporate interests. And prosecutors alleged that some of the money ultimately benefited householder personally. That circular movement was at the heart of the government's case. The $500,000 question. Investigators also examined how money from the network allegedly benefited householder directly. More than $500,000, prosecutors said, was used for personal purposes. Credit card debt. Florida home repairs. A business lawsuit. The significance was not merely financial. It was psychological. If someone receives money indirectly through a political organization, they may attempt to maintain distance from its source. But if that money is then used to pay personal expenses, the distinction between political power and private benefit becomes blurred. The government could argue that householder had a direct personal incentive to maintain the system. The more successful the network was, the more money was available. The more political power householder accumulated, the more useful he became to those providing the money. And the more useful he became, the more valuable his political position was. That is how a cycle can become self-reinforcing. The investigation turns to the referendum. Then investigators examined what happened after HB6 became law. This was crucial. Because if the alleged objective was simply to pass the legislation, the story could have ended in July 2019. But it did not. Opponents launched a referendum campaign. The law was vulnerable. The network needed to defend it. According to prosecutors, millions were spent fighting the referendum. The investigation focused on efforts to obtain information about the signature count. The alleged $15,000 payment became evidence of that effort. And prosecutors also pointed to the alleged offer of $2,500 plus airfare expenses to people collecting signatures. These details help the government argue that the operation was not simply a lobbying campaign. It was an organized effort to preserve the political result after the legislature had already acted. Why the referendum was so dangerous. Think about what the referendum represented. HB 6 had passed through the legislature. Householder had won. First Energy had obtained the legislation it wanted. But the people could still interfere. That meant the ultimate power had shifted away from the State House into the hands of voters. The referendum therefore represented something the political network could not easily control. A public decision. No legislative coalition. No private negotiation. No speaker's office. No lobbyist. Just voters. And if enough signatures were collected, those voters could decide whether HB 6 remained law. According to prosecutors, the network reacted accordingly. The alleged effort to disrupt signature gathering became one of the strongest indicators of how much was at stake. The financial records. Behind all of this was paperwork. Lots of it. Bank statements. Checks. Transfers. Invoices. Political expenditures. Credit card charges. Property-related payments. Corporate documents. Investigators could trace money from one account to another. They could compare dates. They could place transactions beside political events. Suppose a payment arrived. Then a political advertisement appeared. Then a candidate won. Then a meeting occurred. Then legislation moved. The sequence mattered. The government could present the jury with timelines. Not just one event. Years of events. The longer the pattern became, the harder it was to dismiss as coincidence. The defense would have its own story. But the prosecution was only half of the case. Householders' defense would challenge the government's interpretation. That was inevitable. The defense could argue that political relationships are not automatically criminal. Campaign spending is not automatically bribery. A 501(c)(4) organization is not automatically illegal. Lobbying is not illegal. Supporting candidates is not illegal. Even controversial legislation is not evidence of corruption by itself. The defense needed the jury to separate lawful political activity from the government's allegations of criminal conduct. And that distinction would become one of the central battles of the eventual trial. Because the government had to prove more than bad optics. It had to prove a criminal agreement. Beyond a reasonable doubt. The question of intent. Intent is often invisible. You cannot photograph it. You cannot hold it in your hand. A bank transfer can show that money moved. A text message can show that someone wrote something. A vote can show that a lawmaker supported legislation. But none of those things automatically proves what a person intended. Prosecutors therefore needed to construct intent from evidence. What did Householder know? What did he say? What did he do? What did his allies do? What happened after the payments? Did the political activities consistently benefit the same interests? Did the defendants attempt to conceal the source of the money? Did personal expenses become part of the network? These were the questions that would eventually determine whether the government's theory survived in court. The circle tightens. By 2021, the political machine that had appeared so powerful several years earlier was beginning to look fragile. Longstreth had pleaded guilty. Cespedes had pleaded guilty. Generation Now had pleaded guilty. First Energy had entered a federal agreement and agreed to pay $230 million. The investigation continued. Householder remained the central defendant. And Matthew Borges remained alongside him. The government was preparing for trial. The defense was preparing to fight. The case would take years to reach its final courtroom battle. But the investigators had accomplished something important. They had transformed a political scandal into an evidentiary case. The question was no longer simply, did something suspicious happen? The question became, can the government prove exactly what happened? The evidence begins to tell a story. Imagine a large table. On it are documents, bank statements, emails, political advertisements, campaign records, corporate payments, legal bills, credit card statements, property invoices, names, dates, numbers. At first, they look disconnected. But investigators begin arranging them chronologically. March 2017. A payment. Another payment. Another quarter. 2018 election spending. Candidates win. January 2019. Householder becomes Speaker. HB 6 moves. July 2019. HB 6 becomes law. Referendum campaign begins. Political spending increases. Signature gathering efforts are targeted. July 2020. Arrests. The timeline begins to look almost like a machine diagram. Money enters. Political power grows. Legislation emerges. The law is defended. Then the government strikes. The most dangerous evidence. The most damaging evidence in a corruption case is not always the largest payment. Sometimes it is a small message. A sentence. A casual remark. Something written quickly because the person writing it does not believe anyone else will ever see it. A message can reveal assumptions. It can reveal knowledge. It can reveal relationships. It can show that two people were discussing something before the public knew it existed. That is why prosecutors often build cases from communications as much as financial records. Money tells you what happened. Words can tell you why. And the householder investigation increasingly depended on both. The political world could no longer protect him. For years, Householder had operated inside politics. He understood its rules. He knew how campaigns worked. He knew how to build alliances. He knew how to survive political attacks. But federal criminal investigations follow different rules. A political opponent can be defeated in an election. A prosecutor cannot be defeated by a campaign advertisement. A negative television commercial can change public opinion. It cannot erase a bank record. A political ally can defend you publicly. They cannot make a guilty plea disappear. That was the new reality facing Householder. His world had shifted. He was no longer fighting for votes. He was fighting for his freedom. The road to trial. The federal case continued toward 2023. The government prepared a massive evidentiary presentation. The defense prepared its arguments. Potential witnesses were identified. Documents were organized. Financial records were analyzed. The case would eventually last approximately 6 weeks in court. More than 1,000 exhibits would be presented. 25 witnesses would testify for the prosecution. The sheer volume reflected the nature of the alleged conspiracy. This was not a crime that happened in one room. It had allegedly unfolded over years. To prove it, prosecutors had to reconstruct years. And they were preparing to do exactly that. One question above everything else. At the center of the entire investigation was one question. Was HB 6 the product of legitimate democratic politics, or the product of an illegal financial arrangement? That question would determine Householder's fate. If the jury accepted the prosecution's theory, the political network would be viewed as a criminal enterprise. If the jury rejected it, the government's case would collapse. There was no middle ground when it came to criminal liability. The evidence would have to speak. The witnesses would have to speak. And Householder would eventually have to listen as prosecutors described years of his political life in a way he had never publicly acknowledged. By the time the case approached trial, the old political machine was gone. The money trail had been mapped. The guilty pleas had begun. The corporate investigation had expanded. The referendum campaign had become evidence. And the government had assembled thousands of pages of material. But there was still one thing prosecutors needed. They needed to make the jury understand the story. Not just the numbers. Not just the documents. Not just the names. They needed to show how the machine worked. How money became influence. How influence became votes. How votes became a speakership. How the speakership helped produce HB6. And how the people who had built that system allegedly tried to protect it when citizens attempted to challenge the result. The investigation had uncovered the pieces. Now came the moment when those pieces would be placed in front of 12 ordinary people. The courtroom doors would open. The witnesses would take the stand. And for the first time, the hidden machinery of Ohio politics would be examined under oath. The prosecution had spent years following the money. Now it was time to follow the evidence into the courtroom.